Hello. Today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite authors, Robert E. Howard. He wrote pulp fiction in the 1930s for Weird Tales magazine. He's most famous for Conan the Barbarian, Call the Conqueror, and Solomon Kane. I'm going to talk about two books today, and I'm also going to say a little bit about how Robert E. Howard has influenced me and influenced my own writing. So let's start with some of the other things that he wrote. I mean, he mainly wrote sword and sorcery, but he also wrote boxing stories and westerns and detective stories. I'm most familiar with his sword and sorcery. Um, so he's kind of an interesting figure because he committed suicide. Well, I mean, his mother had been ill with tuberculosis for most of her life, and she eventually went into a coma, which they said she wasn't expected to wake from. So when he found this out, he walked out to his car and he shot himself in the head, which is pretty intense. But in some ways, I mean, I could see maybe why he would do that. He wasn't making all that much money from his writing, and maybe his mother was kind of a crutch to him. He seemed like a little bit of an outcast. He had this correspondence with H.P. Lovecraft, which is quite interesting. If you ever get the chance, you can check out some of their letters. And their work, I think, is quite similar. There's a sort of magical component and like the eldritch forces coming into the real world. And I think both of the writers have a very strong voice, iconic in their delivery, and very iconic in pulp culture, I guess. So my first experience with Robert E. Howard was the film Conan the Barbarian with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And when I was a child, this was on cable television a lot. And it was sort of like this forbidden fruit because I was pretty young, maybe like 8 or 9. And, you know, there was a lot of nudity in it and a lot of violence. And it was on usually late at night. And I would catch glimpses of it. And it kind of stayed in my imagination. When I got a little older, I saw the whole movie, and I just thought it was a really strong revenge tale. As far as how accurate it is to the actual stories, I think the spirit is there. As far as the detail of the world, maybe not so much, and in some ways, maybe the newer movie has gotten that more correct. But I think it's one of the best movies of all time, in my opinion. It's a really strong writing and directing, and the acting. I mean, it's Arnold, but he fits for the role, I would say. After seeing that movie on cable, I started picking up the Marvel comics of Conan. And I had a few of those, and those similar thing where, you know, there was a lot of forbidden sort of content in these books, half nude women and, you know, the like. And for a young boy, that was very interesting. Eventually, when I got into high school, I started reading some of his actual stories, along with there's a series from Bantam Books, the Tor series. And actually, this is one of them I have here in Korea. But I read several from this series, I would say in the closer to the late 80s. Books like Conan the Triumphant and Conan the Victorious. They're all pretty interesting. They're actually a little bit more heavy on the scandalous stuff, I guess, than the original books, in my opinion, but they're pretty good, and the stories are much longer. They're full-length novels, most of them, whereas the Howard stories are mostly shorts. And a lot of the covers are by Frank Frazetta, who's a legend, and so they're great for that reason. And, you know, Howard isn't the only person to write Conan. There have been probably around 50 novels and dozens of short stories featuring the Conan character, as well as many, many comic books. Not everybody is a fan of him. A lot of people think that his work has a high level of misogyny in it, and many people think his writing isn't that good, but I disagree with that. I'm going to read real quick a little review that this Lovecraft scholar S.T. Joshi wrote in his biography of H.P. Lovecraft. He says, "The bulk of Howard's fiction is subliterary hackwork that does not even begin to approach genuine literature. And the simple fact is, however, that his views are not of any great substance or profundity, and that Howard's style is crude, slipshod, and unwieldy. It is all just pulp, although perhaps a somewhat superior grade of pulp than the average." Well, it doesn't sound like he liked it too much. On the obverse of that, here's a quick quote from H.P. Lovecraft about his friend. "For stark living fear, what other writer is even in the running with Robert E. Howard?" And I heartily agree with that. And coming from someone like Lovecraft, that's quite a compliment. And someone that also writes a lot about fear also had good things to say about Robert E. Howard, and this is Stephen King. He says, "Howard's writing seems so highly charged with energy that it nearly gives off sparks." And I really agree with that. I'm reading right now this Solomon Kane collection by Del Rey. It's beautiful. And I think, you know, I haven't read some Howard in a while, so it's quite fresh for me right now. And there's so much power behind his words, and you feel it a lot in the Conan film. This sort of strong, almost like Nietzschean, like Ubermensch kind of vibe, like overcoming everything. And I think this bleeds into the language as well. You know, Howard was like an amateur boxer, so he's got this sort of manly vibe to all of his work, but I think that one great thing about his writing is the economy of language. He can really distill some powerful imagery into a very few words, and obviously because he was writing for a magazine, a lot of it is for that reason. But I definitely think it's beautiful prose. Especially like his adjective and adverb choices. I think he really has a knack for choosing colorful language. And what's great about this book that I have, this Savage Tales of Solomon Kane, is, well, as a book designer, I love it because of just the design. I mean, it has beautiful book design. It's fully illustrated, and they chose to make the margins quite wide, so it really looks good when you're reading it, to be honest. And it's very contained here in the center. And it works well because of the illustrations. It kind of makes you feel more like you're in it. And there's also like a few full page or larger illustrations too, like this one. You can see that. I don't know, it's just a brilliant design in my opinion. Here's a quick sample of some text from the short story Skulls in the Stars. "Sir," said the boy, dropping his voice and drawing closer, "we be simple villagers who like not to talk of such things, lest foul fortune befall us. But the moor road is a way accursed, and hath not been traversed by any of the countryside for a year or more. It is death to walk those moors by night, as hath been found by some score of unfortunates. Some foul horror haunts the way and claims men for his victims. So, and what is this thing like? No man knows, none has ever seen it and lived, but late farers have heard terrible laughter far out on the fen, and men have heard the horrid shrieks of its victims. Sir, in God's name return to the village, there pass the night, and tomorrow take the swamp trail to Torkertown." Far back in Kane's gloomy eyes, a scintillant light had begun to glimmer, like a witch's torch glinting under fathoms of cold gray ice. His blood quickened. Adventure, the lure of life risk and battle, the thrill of breathtaking touch-and-go drama. Not that Kane recognized his sensations as such. He sincerely considered that he voiced his real feelings when he said, "These things be deeds of some power of evil. The lords of darkness have laid a curse upon the country. The strong man is needed to combat Satan in his might. Therefore I go, who have defied him many a time." And this is part of a whole series of Howard's works. There's some Conan volumes and some of his other stories. Anyway, I highly recommend this. It also has some unfinished fragments in it, which is interesting to read, especially seeing, as a writer, seeing how some things are just abandoned because you don't know where to take them or maybe run out of time. So it's quite interesting in that regard. But I think Solomon Kane is equally interesting. Most people know Howard for Conan, but if you like any kind of Conan product, I would highly check out Solomon Kane, because he's basically the Puritan version of Conan, but more of like a holy warrior. So he's got this kind of creed that's very strong. And there is a definite similarity with the sort of sorcery part. There's a lot of like devils and demons and things that he's always dealing with, like cannibalism and all kinds of dark things. But obviously the setting is a little bit different. And maybe there's more of an analysis of like a spiritual component, I guess, and maybe some more of Howard's philosophy of life is maybe in this. I think Conan, although I love it, it's a little more hack and slash, but I recommend this highly. And if you like this, I also recommend a movie that they made with James Purefoy, and it's from 2009. It's kind of a B movie, but for a B movie, it's quite successful, I would say. And he's perfect as Solomon Kane. So I would check that out if you get a chance. I don't have all that much more to say, but I will say this, that I'm a big fan of pulp, mainly because it doesn't take itself too seriously. I also like literature, high literature, whatever you want to call it. But I think pulp is great because of its simplicity. And I think the Conan stories and Solomon Kane and H.P. Lovecraft, all those stories have a very direct and powerful economy to them, and that's something I really appreciate. Anyway, that's all I got. I'll talk to you again soon. Have a good day.